Hi, it's me again. I'm here to read chapters 4 and 5 of Maleficent by Elizabeth Rudnick. A week later, Maleficent flew high in the air, noticing a familiar figure roaming around the forest clearing. She smiled and accelerated, then gently dropped down behind Stefan. He turned, startled by her sudden appearance. Well, well, look who came back, she said. I thought it was worth the risk. Maleficent blushed as a small deer emerged from a stand of trees. If I had my bow, I'd make you a fine dinner, Stefan said, gesturing toward the animal. Choosing to ignore the remark, Maleficent walked over to the deer. It was a beautiful creature. She held out her hand in greeting and kneeled before it. The deer nuzzled against her palm. Magic, Stefan breathed, watching them. No, just kindness, Maleficent said, correcting him. She kept her gaze on the deer. Stefan headed behind her, prompting the deer to walk away. Rising, Maleficent turned to face him. When we met, you said, "You're her." What did you mean? She asked. People have seen you, flying. The girl from the moors that looks just like us, except for your wings. He stared at them, clearly wanting to take a closer look. Maleficent held out a wing toward him. You sure? He asked. She nodded, and he gently touched the wing. They're beautiful. Thank you, Maleficent said, looking over her shoulder. They are special, aren't they? Next, Stefan looked up at Maleficent's horns. Are they sharp? He asked. The fairy felt her face turn red, and she bowed her head, suddenly feeling self-conscious. They're majestic, Stefan continued. That's the word. They are far and away the most majestic horns that I have ever seen. Maleficent was overcome with emotion. Without thinking, she hugged him. His body stiffened. It was clear he hadn't been expecting this reaction. But soon she felt them smile. We can choose to be friends, Maleficent said. Why can't the others? Maybe they can. Maybe we can show them. So Maleficent and Stefan bonded over a hope for peace, something that made Maleficent feel closer to her parents than ever. Stefan came to the edge of the moors, the place that became their secret spot. They talked about their lives, their future. Then on Maleficent's 16th birthday, they kissed. A kiss so pure, so honest, so real, it was true love's kiss. But as the years marched on, Stefan spent less time visiting the moors than Maleficent. He was busy making good on his promise to live in the castle as a servant. He seemed less concerned with building harmony between the humans and fairies, and more concerned with his life at the castle, a life he seemed to want to keep private. No matter what questions Maleficent asked out of genuine interest, Stefan avoided answering them. One day, Maleficent soared in the sky, spotting Stefan nearby on a cliff. It had been 3 weeks since she'd last seen him. Stefan, she called down to him. Hello, he replied. Hello, Maleficent repeated. She suddenly felt awkward around him. Where have you been? Stefan asked. Maleficent narrowed her eyes. I've been looking for you. Really? Yes, she responded. You're always disappearing these days. She lowered herself to him for a kiss. They leaned close together, and for a fleeting moment, it all felt right again. Chapter 5. Maleficent leaned against the rowan tree, watching the end of another day. It had been a month since she'd seen Stefan, the longest time yet. Robin and the other fair folk had noticed her growing more solemn and quiet, but she was too ashamed to admit she was feeling a little lovesick, particularly for a human boy. She distanced herself from them, preferring to be alone in case she grew tempted to tell them about her companion, or in case Stefan suddenly appeared. As the sun set, Maleficent's thoughts grew dark as well. She wondered where Stefan was, if he was okay, if he missed her, even a little. Try as she might, Maleficent couldn't shake the sadness that filled her. Was she wrong to trust a human? Had her parents been wrong too? Not for the first time, she wondered what things would have been like had her parents lived. She could just picture the scene, running home to the rowan tree and finding her mother sitting there, her back against the warm trunk. Maleficent would cry and tell her everything, and then her mother would kiss her forehead and tell her it would all be all right. And it would be, somehow. Maleficent shook her head. It was silly to get caught up in a fantasy. She sighed and gave herself a mental shake. She had to snap out of her melancholy. Perhaps she would see what Robin was up to after all. He was always good at cheering her up. Suddenly there was a sound like thunder. Looking over the castle, Maleficent let out a gasp. She had been so caught up in her thoughts that she hadn't noticed the approaching army. It was charging toward the Moors, King Henry's banner flying in the wind. Her heart sank in her chest. It was happening again. Another war. Quickly, Maleficent took to the sky. In the countryside, at the edge of the moors, King Henry sat on his horse, addressing his army. Henry was a man long past his prime. His beard was gray, and the wavy hair on his head was thinning. His waist had thickened over the years, and his fingers ached with arthritis. Despite all that, he held himself proudly, comfortable in his heavy armor. This was not the first time he had gone to war. A kingdom was only as strong as the king who sat on its throne, and Henry had, on more occasions than he could count, proven his strength. But that day was different. More was at stake than ever before. The land of the Moors was vast, and from all reports full of riches beyond imagining. There were natural resources such as fresh water and plentiful forest, and it was rumored that the streams were filled with jewels. And it was taking over the Moors would make his kingdom much more powerful. But those were not the reasons why Henry now stood in front of his army at the edge of the moors. The reason Henry was about to go to war was that the Moors posed a huge threat. The creatures who lived there had magic, and there was no telling what they might do someday with that magic. So Henry wanted them destroyed, and if a consequence of that destruction was access to the rich lands, all the better. As his mount pranced nervously under him, Henry gestured behind himself. "There they are," he began. "The mysterious moors. No one dares to venture there for fear the magical creatures that lurk within." He paused, scanning the crowds for the telltale signs of weakness and fright. Seeing only a handful of men who looked ready to turn back, he went on. "Well, I say, crush them." The army let out a loud cheer. Emboldened, King Henry lengthened his pep talk. "We're not afraid of the magical creatures," he cried. "We have swords." The men waved their weapons high in the air, let out another cheer. "We will take the Moors and kill anything that stands in our way." He threw the signal, and the men charged forward. The first men reached the bottom of a hill covered in mist. They began to climb, the ground shaking under their pounding footsteps. And then they came to a screeching halt. From the other side of the hill, two enormous black wings appeared through the mist. Then a pair of sharp, twisted horns. Slowly, Maleficent rose into the air, looking like a creature from hell. Behind her, there was only mist, no army of her own, no fairies or creatures, just Maleficent. For a moment, Henry was worried. He had been prepared to take the Moors unawares. And the creature hovering in front of him was rather scary, but then he smiled. There appeared to be only one. "Go no further," Maleficent instructed, sounding braver than she felt. King Henry smirked at her gall. "A king does not take orders from a winged elf. You are no king to me." Henry yelled to his troops, "Bring me her head." Once more, the army thundered forward, the sound of hoof-beats mixing with the clinking of armor. As Maleficent watched them approach, her heart thudded in her chest. She couldn't help thinking this was what her parents must have seen and felt during their final moments, but she would do anything to protect the Moors, just as they had. Lifting her wings higher, she let out an ear-piercing shriek and began flying forward. And then from behind her, she felt a surge of magic. Turning, she watched as a malevolent army appeared. They clawed and climbed their way up the hill. Some of the creatures were scaled. Others had feet turned backward, while others had leather wings. Some snarled, while others slobbered like diseased hounds. There were ones who walked upright and others who crawled along on four legs. But they all had one thing in common. They wanted to protect their home. And they had defended this place from invading humans many times before. As the hodgepodge army of creatures approached, Maleficent nearly cried in relief. She had been so scared that she wouldn't be able to rise to the occasion to fight at the front lines if it had ever come to this. But now she had her army, who had no doubt rushed to her when they had learned of the trouble, and she felt braver with the creatures behind her. She had become their makeshift leader, and they were ready. Giving a signal, she watched as they began to attack viciously. Confident that the creatures could take care of the larger army, Maleficent set her sights on King Henry. As soon as she had seen the moorland army, the king had turned his horse and began racing for home. But Maleficent wasn't going to let him go that easily. He was one of the monstrous humans, the kind Robin had warned her about. The kind who came to destroy everything she cared about for his own gain. The kind who killed her parents, her fury rising as she took to the air and flew after him. It took her only a moment to catch up to Henry. From above, she battered the king with her wings until he fell off his horse. She landed and stood looming above him. "You will not have the Moors now or ever," she cried, her voice booming. Frightened, King Henry raised his armored hand, trying to protect himself from Maleficent. As he did, the iron gently brushed Maleficent's cheek. She let out a gasp and raised a hand to her face. Where the iron had touched her skin, it burned painfully. Noticing that his enemy was distracted, King Henry scrambled to his feet and hobbled away, wheezing in pain. All around him, the rest of the army retreated, as well running fast as they could from the terrifying creatures. Sighing, Maleficent gave a signal, and her army seized its attack. Maleficent saw more familiar faces among the ranks. Balthazar nodded at Maleficent, and she nodded back, hoping she was conveying the gratitude she felt. Robin, though shaken, looked undeniably proud of her. She bowed her head and flew away, afraid of what he looked at her. If he looked at her long enough, he could tell she'd been spending time with one of the humans he despised, even if that human seemed to be good. As she headed back into the moors, Maleficent was left alone with her thoughts. A human attack. Could they dare to hope that this would be the end of it? That peace could still be possible? How she wished she could talk to Stefan. Maybe they could make a plan to form some sort of treaty between the fairies and the humans. But a nagging notion interrupted her with other thoughts. What if Robin was right? What if all the humans banded together against them? What if Stefan sided with King Henry? That is the end of chapter 5. Make sure you guys look out for chapters 6 and 7.